All right, raise your hand if you've ever built a piece of IKEA furniture. If you've built IKEA furniture before, then you know about IKEA instructions. IKEA, in all their brilliance, have created these little instruction manuals that have no words at all and only pictures and sort of smiling little faces of cartoon characters, encouraging you that you will be able to create this bookshelf and you won't get anything wrong and you won't put a nail through the back of the thing. IKEA instructions can be pretty frustrating in my personal opinion and personal experience, but let me tell you what's not frustrating. Having a set of instructions and a guideline for reading primary sources. Woo! Yeah. That's what we're going to look at in this video. I'm going to give you a sort of instruction manual for reading and analyzing primary sources. Okay, this video is going to be in a few parts, right? First, we're going to talk just very briefly about how and why we approach primary sources critically. And then we're going to get into our kind of method of analyzing primary sources. And I'm going to have a section for each part of the method. The method is what I like to call the SC3 method. And you'll see why I call it that in a little bit. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about why we have to have a sort of method for approaching primary sources. Why isn't it just as easy as picking something up and reading it and knowing what it says? So we remember that sources are absolutely important for the historian, right? They're the building blocks for how historians write about the past and how they make kind of truth claims about the past. But we also know that historians have to treat their sources critically. It's not enough to just find sources. Historians also have to read them carefully to understand and kind of evaluate what types of evidence can be trusted in those sources and what is less trustworthy. So the question is, how do we do that work? How do we do that work of evaluation and analysis? Well, in this class, we're going to use, we're going to adopt a method that was developed by the Stanford History Education Group. If you don't know anything about the Stanford History Education Group, I highly recommend, especially if you are a secondary ed major, to go and check out their website. They have all sorts of modules and resources for history teachers that are really, really great. But one of the things that the Stanford History Education Group has is what they call their reading like a historian curriculum. And they set out essentially a few different tasks for reading primary sources like a historian. It's a 4-part kind of system that I like to refer to as the SC3 system. Included in this kind of way of historical thinking, right, in this way of approaching primary sources, is the work of sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. So this is going to be the way that we approach analyzing primary sources in this class. And frankly, it's just a good way to do it in general when you go forward in other history classes. The first part is sourcing. Okay, step 1, sourcing. So what is sourcing? Sourcing is essentially just coming to understand the nature of the document that you have at your disposal. So there's a few things that we do to source a document appropriately. And yes, we use the word sourcing, or to source, as a verb. We first answer questions about the author. Who wrote this document, or who created this artifact? And what is that author's perspective? And what we mean by perspective here is that author affiliated with certain groups or communities? And might that tell us a little bit about how that author is approaching, say, the subject that they're writing about? But we have to also answer other questions about the source. For example, why was it written? This question essentially gets us to think about the intentionality of the source. Is this an intentional document, or is it an unintentional document, right? Is it a law that's meant to be sort of written and codified and then read and used by lots of people, or was it a grocery list from H-E-B? And then there are other simple questions. When was it written? This helps us determine what this primary source is going to help us answer. We know that primary sources are It's supposed to be from the time and place that we are studying. So if we find out that a source was written in a totally different time or written in a totally different place, well, then we know that it's not super valuable for understanding the history that we're interested in understanding. And then the final question we have to ask is it reliable? And what we mean by this is essentially, is this a genuine account of the past, or is this a reliable primary source? So when you're going and looking for primary sources, one of the things you're going to have to do is kind of check the reliability of the version of the source that you found. If you've found something in, say, a published source, then you're going to want to kind of push further to see if you can find it in its original form. So what do we need to do the work of sourcing? Well, first we can get a lot of this information within the text of the document itself. But sometimes we need to also consult other materials, like, for example, introductory materials in edited collections. And finally, we might also look at metadata attached to the source. This is most common if you find a primary source through a database. Databases will not only give you the kind of images of the source itself, but it will also provide you with a bunch of metadata or data on the author or data on when the source was produced. And that will usually be in some sort of side column or at the top of the web page or something like that. All right, so let's check out an example of this. So I've pulled up here a newspaper article that I found through a database called Accessible Archives. You can see this database, or you can find this database on the Baylor databases page. And now if I were sourcing this newspaper article, I would need to find out the answer to the various questions that we just went over. Fortunately, I can answer all of these questions using the Accessible Archives metadata, as well as a little bit of outside research. So let's check it out. First and foremost, we can see that we are seeing the newspaper article in kind of a text form, right? Almost as a web page. You can see sort of here. And that's really good because it makes it really easy to read. The other thing that Accessible Archives does is it provides its metadata at the top of the web page. So this will help us answer some of these questions right away. For example, who is the author of the piece? Well, it's William C. Nell. And if we don't know anything about William C. Nell, we can just go to a reliable database to sort of find out more. So for example, if I type in William Cooper Nell into Credo, I'll find an article on William Cooper Nell, and I'll find out that he was an African-American educator, editor, and abolitionist who wrote for various newspapers, including the newspaper in question, the North Star. From that information from Credo, also, I know a little bit about the author's perspective. I know that he was an abolitionist. So he's writing sort of from the perspective of abolitionism. Why was it written? Well, this is a sort of easy answer for us because it's a newspaper article. We know that it's a mass media document. And mass media documents are almost entirely intentional documents. They are produced so that a wide readership can read them and understand their opinions. So the purpose of its creation is essentially to educate, influence, and inform a large population of people. When was it created? Well, that's easy too. The metadata provides that information too. April 10th, 1851. Where? Simple. Rochester, New York. And finally, to figure out the last question of is it reliable or not, Accessible Archives does something really good. So if we were to just see this on the web, right? If I were just to find this article on the web, I might be a little nervous about trusting if this is actually the newspaper article that it attests to be, that it sort of proclaims to be. Because in the way that I'm looking at it right here, we just see kind of text on a website. So we know that in 1851, the internet didn't exist. So obviously, this isn't the exact form of the primary source. So what will we need to kind of test the reliability of this web page, right? Of this sort of version of the primary source? Well, the best thing would be the actual newspaper itself. Now, chances are you aren't in a place where you can get a copy of the North Star from 1851. So what's the next best thing? If we can't get the actual physical newspaper in our hands, what might be the next best thing? Well, the next best thing would be a sort of image of the physical newspaper. And that Accessible Archives provides. If you go up to page image here, you'll see here is a facsimile, right? A digitization of the actual newspaper. And the article in question is right here at the bottom. So all of our sourcing can be done in a matter of moments using the metadata of the website and some outside tertiary sources. Okay, step 2, Contextualization. Contextualization is essentially gathering background information that helps you understand what the source says and how it says it. So some questions that we answer in order to kind of set up a good historical context for the document is, when and where was this document created? What was different then and what was the same? And how might the circumstances in which the document was created affect its content? In other words, we need to know about the world in which the document was produced in order to understand that document. There will be names used, there will be events mentioned, there will be situations or realities of society or culture that are just sort of assumed by whoever was supposed to read that document, but not necessarily clear for the historian reading a document that's, say, hundreds of years old. So how do you establish the context, right? How do you do the work of contextualization? Well, first thing you can do is consult tertiary or secondary sources about the historical context. Another thing that you might look at to establish a good historical context is other primary sources. If you're gathering lots of different primary sources on a topic, sometimes they'll help contextualize situations for each other. And finally, again, if you find a primary source through, say, a published collection, that published collection will usually have some sort of introductory material, say an introduction in a book, or kind of introductory paragraphs in front of the excerpts of the primary sources that you're reading. And those introductory materials oftentimes include a lot of contextualization, right? A lot of information about the historical context, about the time and place when the thing was created. Okay, again, let's take a look at an example of how to contextualize a primary source. So I went to a database called Archives Direct, which is a sort of digitization project of the National Archives in Britain. And in scanning through, I just found a document that is about South Africa in the 1970s. Now, for my sourcing, I know that this is a document that's essentially from an intelligence agent for Great Britain, right? It's a government document. And that intelligence agent is attending a meeting of NATO in order to report on the kind of conversations happening there. So I already know the when and where of the document, right? I know it was created in 1976, in December 1976 specifically, and I know that it was created in Brussels at this meeting of NATO. So the question now becomes, what was different and what was the same? In other words, sort of what kinds of things do we recognize about the context of this document? Well, let's skip to the part that I'm most interested in, which is the passage on South Africa. Oh, zoomed in too far there. There we go. Okay. All right. So one of the things that we might do when we're first reading this is we might sort of recognize some things that we both kind of recognize and understand, and also note some things that we don't understand. So let's just take a look at this paragraph. The paragraph reports on a person named Kissinger and said, Kissinger saw the problems here, meaning in South Africa, as threefold. The relationship between the white settlers and the blacks, the relationship between the black leaders themselves, both domestically and between different countries, and the impact which outside powers would have. The underlying aim of U.S. policy had been to avoid the West becoming lined up behind the white settlers in a way which would have led to the radicalization of the whole of black Africa. He had attempted to promote moderate solutions as against the radical ones suggested from outside, but the Angola experience had made this task extremely difficult. Okay, let's just stop there. What we see are there are some things that come up that we might not know much about, or that are important for understanding what the heck this means. For example, let's just start with Kissinger. You may start reading this and go, well, who the heck is Kissinger? The easy way to figure this out is to do the work of contextualization. So we go, for example, to Credo. And I just typed in Kissinger. And what came up were a lot of articles on a guy named Henry Kissinger. If we look in at an article from the Encyclopedia of American Foreign Policy, we find out that Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Gerald Ford, and the National Security Advisor under President Nixon. So when the document is talking about Kissinger and what Kissinger said, it's talking about this guy, Henry Kissinger, and we know a little bit about who he is from that tertiary source. Another thing we might be asking ourselves is how might these circumstances, right, the circumstances being talked about in this document, have affected the content? In other words, how did the historical context help us understand what's being said and why it's being said? Well, a good example here might be to look into what was meant by this sentence, but the Angola experience had made this task extremely difficult. What did this British diplomat mean, or British intelligence officer mean, when he said that Kissinger said the Angola experience had made this task extremely difficult? What is the Angola experience? Well, again, let's do the work of contextualization. Go to Credo and I just typed in Angola 1970s. I got a bunch of articles here on the country of Angola, and I went specifically to a tertiary source on world history, a historical one, right? The Chambers Dictionary of World History. And if you go to the article here on Angola, it'll give you a little bit about where Angola is and the state itself. But then it had this really important sentence which helps us understand and contextualize what we were seeing in the primary source. Here we can see, right, that Angola became an overseas province of Portugal in 1951 and gained independence in 1975. Ooh, that's a year before our primary source. Shortly afterwards, civil war broke out between the Marxist MPLA government and two factions, the UNITA and the FNLA, both of which received arms from the United States in 1975 and 1976. So this seems very likely that this is what we were talking about when this is what the intelligence officer and Kissinger were talking about back in the other document when they referred to the Angola situation. So here we go. This is what contextualization looks like. It looks like reading the document and picking out the things that you need to know more about, right? The historical context that will help you understand what's going on in the document, why things are being said the way that they're being said. Step 3, corroboration. Corroboration is essentially the comparison of documents to each other in order to kind of come to a more reliable conclusion about what those documents say. In other words, it's kind of the work of cross-referencing facts or information that are included in sources with facts and information included in other sources. To do the work of corroboration, we have to answer the questions, what do other documents say about the thing that our original document is sort of talking about? Do the documents agree? If not, why? And what are other possible documents that are out there that could provide different perspectives on the event in question? The work of corroboration is all about other documents. So in order to do the work of primary source analysis, you have to always find other documents in addition to the one that you are focusing on. Okay, so how do we do the work of corroboration? Well, let's take an example. Let me try to show you. So I found a newspaper article from this database, the British Library Newspapers. And this article comes from the publication, the newspaper, The Morning Post out of London, England. And it was dated January 26, 1885. Here's what the article says. It's titled Charge of Intimidation. And it begins by saying this. At the Guildhall Police Court on Saturday, Edward John Moody, a compositor belonging to the London Society of Compositors, was charged before Mr. Alderman Stone on 3 distinct charges. The first was for assaulting Alfred Wilkinson, the second for intimidating him, and the third for threatening Mr. Kingdom. Now, I'm going to skip down a little bit to get to sort of what was said that happened. Okay, I'm going to pick up here in the middle to find out kind of what happened, what's supposed to have happened. So here it says, on Friday, when he left the premises, he here is Wilkinson, one of the people who was victims of the crime. It said, on Friday, when he left the premises, he went into a public house to have his dinner. And while there, the defendant, this is Mr. Moody, came up to him and said that if he were witness, he would get out of there as soon as possible. Witness refused to go, and the defendant went on, but returned in a few minutes and took him by the shoulder and said, now get out. I thought somebody was waiting for me, but they are not there. Thrust him out of the house, and witness lost his hat and took refuge in Mr. Kingdom's premises. Okay, so the article goes on about the incident, but you might be reading this and going, okay, that's a little bit about what happened, but I kind of want to see if what's said here makes sense or if it's trustworthy or true, right? Think about the work of corroboration as looking at what's said in one source and asking, are there other sources out there that would help to attest to that story or support it in some way or contradict it in some way? So I went about the work of finding another source that might help corroborate this story. And what I found was the actual trial records for Edward John Moody from this case. And here, Alfred Wilkinson, the same guy, was brought into court and asked about the incident. Here's what he said. He said, I came out about 4 o'clock and went into Bull and Bell public house just by, about 20 yards off. I waited there about 20 minutes. Then the prisoner, or in other words, the defendant, and several more came in. He said I'd better get out. I said I had as much right as he to stay there. It was a public bar. He said if I didn't get out, he would dash my brains out. After that, I went out. Later on that evening, a little after 7 o'clock, I went into the public house again, and the prisoner, or the defendant, right, Moody, came in. He repeated the same language. He said he would dash my brains out if I didn't get out. And he said he was not fool enough to do it himself. He might get 3 months for it, but he would get someone else to do it for him. He left the house for a short time then, and returned about a half an hour, and he said, "Are you still here? If you don't get out, I shall do what I said. I shall dash your brains out." And he took me by the shoulders with both hands, pushed me out the door, and hit me on the side of the head with his fist and knocked my hat off. It was a pretty keen blow. Okay, so what have we just seen? Well, we've seen Wilkinson's account kind of straight from him in the courtroom, and a newspaper account that talks about what Wilkinson said, essentially. So we see a little bit of corroboration between the two accounts. Similarities here, but also differences. More detail in the actual court records where he talks about getting his hat knocked off because he was hit in the head, essentially. If we scroll down a little later, we can see that other witnesses were cross-examined as well, including this guy Kingdon, who was the person whose house the victim sort of rushed into. Kingdon says in his testimony that at about 8:30, I heard a noise outside and Wilkinson rushed in without his hat, again, rather excited, followed by 2 women who said he'd been knocked down and badly served. So again, this is the work of corroboration. Now we're seeing from a different source, right? Or I should say from a different person's perspective, a little bit more about what happened in the incident. So we could keep going with this, but you see kind of basically what the work of corroboration looks like. It basically looks like reading sources next to each other to try to compare and contrast what they say. If multiple sources agree on something, then the historian has a little better feeling that what they say is probably true, right? Or closer to the truth. And if they disagree, well, then that raises questions about what happened and how it happened and why it happened. And the final step of the SC3 method is 4, close reading. This is when we really go to the mat with the primary source and figure out exactly what it says and how it says it. Questions that you need to answer when you are close reading a document include, what claims does the author make? Right? Is the author making some sort of argument or case or interpretation or observation about the past? What evidence does the author use? What language does the author use to persuade the document's audience? In other words, how is the document actually written and presented? That's an important part of understanding the document too. It's not just figuring out what the document says, it's also figuring out how the author says it. And you do this by focusing on the document itself. You have to spend time with these primary sources, really reading them carefully and slowly to understand not just what the author is intending to say, but also how the author is saying it. And to exemplify this and show you a little bit about how this works, I've pulled up a primary source here from a database on sort of women's suffrage documents. And I found a document called A Manual of Women's Suffrage Principles, which was published in New York by the New York State Women's Suffrage Association in 1901. And here's how the document begins. It says, "What was the legal status of women in the United States 65 years ago? Women were without a recognized individuality in any department of life. Why? Because they had no voice in the government. What is government? It is the direction and control of human interests. In the United States, how is this direction and control accomplished? By the ballot. By whom was the ballot used? By male citizens. Was there a class of male citizens especially educated and fitted for the purpose? No. All male citizens over 21 years of age were competent, excepting idiots, lunatics, criminals, in some states, paupers. And what did the male citizen discriminate against the female? He denied her equal opportunities in education and in commercial and professional employments. He allowed her, if married, no control of her wages or property, real or personal, or guardianship of her children. Women had no voice in the administration of schools, hospitals, prisons, or asylums." Okay, so let's just stop there and do a little bit of close reading. What does this say? Well, it's talking simply about the status of women in the United States in the kind of end of the 19th century. And we learn a few specific things from this, right? About what women were allowed to do, about who could vote and who couldn't vote in this situation, in this time and place. But again, it's not just about fact-finding. We also want to read documents. When we close read, we want to read documents to sort of understand their tone and the way that they're constructing their language and sort of using their language to get points across. So here, right, we can read this and go and get a sort of sense of what the point of this document is. The point of this document is to point out that the status of women in the United States was of a lower class than men, right? They were barred from the citizenship rights that men had. and barred from lots of social and economic and cultural rights as well. But if we look even closer at this, if we take an even closer look, we can tell that the very format tells us something too. Look at the way that this information is conveyed. It's conveyed in a kind of question and answer style, right? What was the legal status of women in the United States 65 years ago? That's the question. Then answer. Women were without a recognized individuality in any department of life. Why? Question, right? Answer, because they had no voice in the government. And what does this remind me of? Well, it reminds us sort of the format of a catechism. It's essentially the exact same thing. It's like a religious catechism, except instead of a catechism for like Catholic doctrine or Protestant or Lutheran doctrine or something like that, it's a catechism for women's suffrage principles. So this tells us a little bit about what this document is and what it's trying to do. It's not just trying to convey facts about the past. It's trying to essentially function as a training manual, a thing to give women associated with that organization the sort of answers to important questions that are central to their cause and central to why they're doing what they're doing. So this is what close reading looks like. It looks like not just reading something to figure out what it says, but to look at how it says what it says, why it says what it says, so that we can apply that to understand the past. Okay, so why is all of this important? Well, first and foremost, this method, the SC3 method, is going to be useful for reading primary sources in whatever class you take here. Every history class is going to have primary sources, and in every single history class that you take, you will be able to use the SC3 method to sort of understand what those primary sources are and why they're important for the historian. Okay, the final thing I want to say about this is that this skill of primary source analysis is actually a very transferable skill. What I mean by that is that it's not just useful for, history students or people in history classes, right? This is a method for understanding the value of a document or a text or an artifact or something that can be used as a piece of evidence for an argument, right? Or some sort of analytical writing. This skill, you might not think much of it, but this is a skill that's used in workplaces all around the globe, right? People are constantly being asked to evaluate the integrity of evidence in order to make some sort of interpretation or claim, right? Whether it be business records to make some sort of judgment on a business strategy, or memos to make some sort of recommendation about a policy decision. You can use the SC3 method to just understand what a source says and why it's significant for some sort of interpretation or argument or opinion. So go forth and SC3. Go out and use this in analyzing primary sources in history classes and just using it in regular day life. All right, that's it for this video. See you in class.